It is perhaps common knowledge that PC gaming is best on desktop computers, and especially if you wish to play both graphics and CPU-intensive games. But for a massive part of my PC gaming years, I've been gaming on various laptops, the latest one being the MSI Raider GE76. Horrible name, I know, but not necessarily that convoluted as laptop names go. But how well does this 2022 model contend with the latest and greatest in strategy gaming? And first and foremost, are gaming laptops, including this one, even a good option for strategy gamers? I'll give you my opinions in an understandable and relatable way, telling you exactly the type of performance you can expect without boring you with all the numbers and graphs. And by the way, while I have you here, only 9% of people watching this video are subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy my content, guys, it would mean so much to me if you made a simple click and sub to the channel. It really goes a long way in helping my content reach further and hopefully help you in knowing when there's new content to be enjoyed. I'd really appreciate it. Now, first of all, why would you even want a gaming laptop, since they're both less powerful and more expensive than equivalent desktop PCs? The answer is of course portability and arguably ease of use, and I have found them to be a miracle in terms of allowing me to work from wherever or whenever I find myself. With that obvious question out of the way, let's dive into what the MSI GE76 is all about. This version comes with an RTX 3070 Ti, an Intel i7-12700H CPU, 32GB of RAM, and 1TB SSD storage, and a 360Hz 1080p screen. It's no longer one of the most high-end laptops you can get with the RTX 4000 series available, but it absolutely packs a punch, and is honestly probably one of the best performance to price ratio laptops in the higher-end segment you can find right now, especially if you catch it on sale. With the screen being confined to HD though, unless you work some Nvidia magic, you will be gaming in full HD, meaning you won't have to spend those precious frames on either 2K or 4K resolutions. Now there are a lot of games we could talk about here, many of which I've already shown on this channel, but since strategy is the mainstay, this video will focus entirely on that, covering one or two series in particular, beginning with the ever-relevant Total War series. As I mentioned in my last video, Total War has gone through a lot of different iterations in terms of engines, but in almost every aspect, fortune is on your side. I've chosen a few examples in this video to show the full range of the series and this laptop, and of course, everything shown here runs at 1080p. And let's begin with the latest first. Warhammer 3 released only last year, and it's one of the best looking Total War games out there. Luckily, it's also one of the best running ones in terms of that sweet visual to performance ratio. In my experience, Warhammer 3, at max settings, runs mostly anywhere between 60 to 80 frames per second, although some frame drops do occur. As you expand your vision of the map, it is likely that frames will fall a little, but in my experience, nothing that will make it unplayable or drastically different. The same goes on the battlefield, where in the vast majority of cases, the FPS lays around 60 to 90. As you can imagine, the size of armies has the ultimate impact here, but in a case like this, where two full armies meet head-on, the MSI easily handles it. The same story also goes for Troy, although Troy is an even better example. For the most part on max settings, Troy hovers around 80 to 90 FPS on the campaign map, almost never dropping below, making for an extremely pleasant experience. Again, Troy's battle maps performs almost equally well as Warhammer 3, running anywhere between 50 to 100 frames depending on the situation. In terms of how future-proof this computer is in terms of Total War, I think these results bode really well, as it shows that Creative Assembly's engine has finally managed to merge visual fidelity with performance. What's always so weird to me is how Rome 2 performs when compared to Attila, because this laptop shows some interesting results. On the campaign map, Rome 2 mostly holds a high level of frames, and depending on where you are, will offer between 60 to 100 FPS. This is from the Empire Divided campaign, where a large part of the map is shown already. It's mostly a smooth experience, although Rome 2's engine itself means that there will be certain frame hiccups here and there, which sadly can't be avoided. In comparison, running Attila on this computer is actually the best Attila experience I've ever had this far, and that's no joke. The campaign map somehow offers frames anywhere between a low of 45 to a high of 122 even while moving. We talk a lot about how unoptimized Attila is, and it for sure says something when the frames vary with literally 80 points depending on where you're looking, and that this is a relatively high-end computer made so long after the game's release. But the fact that Attila actually performs now should be a promising fact for many of you, who I know lament this game's performance. However, there are two caveats here. Attila runs by far the best with an Intel processor, which this laptop happens to have luckily. I've previously tested Attila running on a Ryzen processor, and there it performs at about 1/3 of what it does here. And all I'm saying is, if you want to play Attila or Total War in general, Intel is first and foremost the safest bet. Of course, the battlefield is a different experience, and that goes for both Rome 2 and Attila. Rome 2 actually manages fairly well here, if we remember that this is an older title with a less optimized engine. At max settings, Rome 2 hovers mostly between 60 to 100 frames, although this will drop in massive melees. Rome 2 does a fairly good job of keeping the frames from tanking completely though, mostly staying in the 50s and 60s. The same cannot be said for Attila. In pre-battle stages, Attila manages fine, but Attila's main issue is that once battle begins and those units begin to blob, the performance tanks with it. As you can see, we have massive drops here down to the 30s and even the 20s, and that is not pretty. Something I will say though is that in the heat of battle, if you're not really paying attention to frames constantly, even the high 20s doesn't really ruin the immersion. Strategy games are different beasts than for example first-person shooters after all, and there's even a difference between battle and campaign maps here. While I would find 30 FPS on the campaign map unplayable, 30 FPS in battles aren't necessarily all that bad if it only happens under certain circumstances. Attila's FPS does rise as fast as it tanks after all, so unless you're constantly down and dirty with a few hundred or thousand troops on screen at once, it's very possible to have a good time even here. If we go further back to Empire, this is arguably where the real fun begins. Empire still looks beautiful, and luckily, none of the performance issues the game might have had at launch even manages to touch this laptop, especially on the campaign map. Empire never even comes close to scratching the 100 FPS mark and actually hovers around anywhere between 130 to 200 FPS, meaning any drops in this area is even hardly noticed. It's just a fantastic overall experience and will never let you down, and the same goes for Napoleon as well. However, the same exponential increases are not to be found on the battle maps, even though we here too maintain very high frames. The lowest I've managed to find here are in the 50s, while the highest frames hover around 120 when zooming out. The difference is big, but the experience never feels bad at all, as these are consistent high frames after all, and luckily never drop into the 40s or lower, unless perhaps something truly wild is happening like having dozens of thousands of soldiers on the field. But for any regular player and a campaign, even in large battles, the MSI will serve you very well. Now, the last Total War I will be covering is Rome Remastered, as this is a fairly odd one. Rome Remastered is the optimized Rome version for modern hardware, but something is off here. We see that the regular FPS is high on the campaign map, but certain hiccups or places will see a drop. You'll also experience varying performance depending on whether you're using the full CD UI or not, as if for some reason it's hard-coded to be influencing performance, as it did in the original release as well. This means that even though the veil of high FPS is here, constant frame drops seem to occur when moving around the map relatively quickly, which definitely is a shame. It's still fully playable though, just not as smooth as I'd like. Oddly enough, we're seeing kind of the same thing happening on the battle maps as well. Performance never strays too high, nor does it admittedly fully tank. But for an old, yet supposedly optimized game like this, to perform worse than Empire, Rome 2, and Warhammer 3 is admittedly kinda strange. I love Rome Remastered and it's absolutely possible to have a fantastic experience here. Just know that the performance won't necessarily match your hopes. And that's it for the Total War games, which I believe run anywhere from acceptable to extremely well on this laptop. And if you really need a laptop for gaming, then this is no bad option at all. But what about other, perhaps more CPU intensive games? Well, as a bonus, let's take a quick look at some Paradox games. Victoria 3 is the latest in the series and quite intense to boot, but nothing our dear MSI can't handle. Often hovering around 90 FPS with some increases or decreases depending, Victoria 3 is actually fairly well optimized, especially in terms of how much there is to see here. Crusader Kings 3 as well runs extremely well, for the most part staying well above the 100 FPS mark, whether out on the map or down in the throne room. Hearts of Iron 4 is likely the modern series low, with FPS mostly hanging around 60, but of course dropping to potentially half or even lower when running on higher speeds. And finally, EU4 is no match for this PC either, with high frames during regular gameplay and a lowered framerate when playing on Speed 5. All of these games are played with maxed out graphic settings, and so, if you love Paradox, this is absolutely a good machine to own. All in all, if you mainly play strategy games, the MSI Raider GE76 is a great option in my experience. Most if not all games in the Total War series and the Paraverse play as you'd expect or even perhaps even surprisingly well, and even then there's room for more frames if you're willing to lower the graphics. In the end, laptops are expensive, and you might not get the same performance of an equally priced desktop PC. But if you are getting a laptop, there's often a reason for it. This laptop shows that there's almost no reason to compromise here either. because as a 1080p machine, this thing is actually quite the beast, especially if you find it on sale. The same obviously goes for similarly spec'd laptops from other brands, but this is at least the case for the GE76 especially. Thank you so much for watching. This video is a bit different from what I usually do, and I hope you got a good overview of the performance of these games in this limited showcase without massive graphs and crazy non-layman jargon. If you are gaming on a laptop or looking for something new, or if you have thoughts about this video, let me know in the comments. And as always, make sure to leave a like and sub to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.